Can I get you to start by saying, do you define yourself as being international political economy, or perhaps not?
That's an interesting question to start with. And I do think, on the one hand, yes, I do identify with being, an IPE scholar, or usually I use the term global political economy. I think it fits a little bit better because the international, we're beyond that. Although I always feel like I'm in a very special sort of sub-area or subfield of IPE or GPE. And that is that I do a lot of stuff on development. That's actually where I started. I do a lot of stuff on obviously on gender issues. And since basically almost 15 years, I've always also been working on migration. So yes, I always look at the intersections. And at one point when people, sort of the mainstream IPE was very much about finance, trade. Those are the kinds of things. Yes, I understand them. I've engaged with them, but it's not really the area that I feel most comfortable with. So I'm more at the margins and always looking at how can I expand or go beyond the sort of the narrow IPE kinds of things. And what I also found interesting, because very early on, also critical scholarship within IPE has identified IPE as the relationship between the state and the market, or the political and economic side of things. And sort of toward the mid-1990s, end of 1990s, we expanded it to include civil society, or if you want, global civil society. And that's where I feel more comfortable, because you can talk about triangular, if you want to think in terms of binaries and so on, triangular relationships, and also include the social. And in particular also, especially from a feminist perspective, you can include the household, etc. Right? So, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So what influenced you to thinking about when you first started out working across all those different areas? What was the influence? What motivated you?
Well, my background in terms of disciplinary background was I did an undergraduate and a master's degree, at that particular time in the Netherlands we had sort of different levels of degrees. So I did what is now the equivalent of a master's and the undergraduate in history, because we didn't at that particular time have a department or sort of graduate studies in international relations. So I was interested in the international, and I took some courses in the law faculty on international relations, international law, and I created a sort of my own package within history on contemporary history and economics, or economic history. So I had an interest in the economic part. And one of the things that really triggered was at that time, the whole debates around the new international economic order, which goes back a little bit of time. Okay, so that was one of the things. So I was interested in North-South issues. I was interested in, transformations in the global or international system, the global political economy. And I started to look for different sources. So I started out with history. I added, the parts in terms of international law and international relations. And then I went abroad first to Paris. And I did a sort of first year of a doctoral program there, also to get a sort of an idea of French literature on international relations. And what I realized was that at that particular time, I'm not saying right now, but at that particular time, it was still very traditional international relations. And then I went for a year to Mexico with a scholarship. That was my first sort of, study abroad in the global South, if you want. I interviewed at that moment actually a couple of people, Luis Echeverria, because Mexico had been very important in getting the new international economic order on the international agenda. So I interviewed the ex-president Luis Echeverria, some of the people around him, and then for personal reasons, I went to the U.S. To finish my doctorate, and that is. It was a small department at that particular time. It was Arizona State University, but there were a lot of people doing international relations and sort of cutting-edge international relations. So we had 2 political economists, we had a post-structuralist, and that is where really things started to open up for me. And I started to put sort of the little pieces into place. So my interest has been always in Mexico, Latin America in general, but mostly Mexico, and then adding the sort of more critical scholarship, also not having been disciplined in terms of not having been in a political science or international relations undergraduate program, but the history program. So I came from the outside, and that allowed me to also think about these things slightly differently.
Were there particular people who maybe you had a professional relationship that influenced you?
Yeah. I think just in terms of steering me in the right direction, there was one person in the Netherlands, Kooijmans. He was actually, he was at one point the Secretary of State in the Netherlands. He later joined the International Court of Justice, but he was one of the people who directed me to academia, because if you're interested in international relations, especially back then, many people were thinking about the diplomatic service. So I came to him with the question, okay, what do you think? Shall I do this? And he said, you won't have any problem getting into the diplomatic service, but that's not for you. It was a very honest kind of, recommendation. He said, that's not your area. So basically he said, I recommend that you continue with academia. So that was on a personal level. And I learned also, because at that particular time, or just before I knew him, he had also been the rapporteur for the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. So he really knew the international system, also the human rights discussions that were going on. So in that sense, he really sensitized me to some of these issues. And then in the United States, three people actually, who really influenced me. One was my supervisor, Pat McGowan, who was a critical political economist. He used Wallerstein and so on. And then Richard Ashley, who was doing post-structural stuff. I mean, I was there at the moment that the International Studies Quarterly was being run by the editorial team. And then Karen Rassler. And Karen Rassler was also doing IPE a little bit more, mainstream IPE, but the long waves kinds of things. And she taught some of us a course on methodology. And in that group, there were a couple of people, but the ones you probably have heard of are Cindy Weber and myself. And we were not the people for quantitative methods. And so Karen said, okay, I know you're not into quantitative methods, but think about it this way. You learn the language, and then at least you have the tools to basically criticize any bad piece in terms of quantitative methods. And so that was what we did in the end. And turned out okay, and we still very good. We still have a good relationship. I actually ran into her at this conference, so yeah.
Brilliant. One of the things that we were quite interested in terms of talking to you about was you were really at that kind of forefront of raising gender issues in relation to IPE.
Mm-hmm.
And we just wondered, is there a story around that? Was that how easy was that to do? Did people listen to those kinds of concerns? Do you have to fight quite hard to get that on the agenda?
I'm not 100% sure how it all came together, but it came together at Arizona State in discussing things with Cindy. At one point we were housemates, so lots of discussions there. There were some other graduate students. Some have moved beyond or outside of academia. And there was also, and I'm trying to, sorry, I can't remember at this particular point her name. There was a woman from India. She had also worked on women's issues in India through non-governmental organizations. And we got into all these discussions about development, about gender and development, and so on. And one of the things that it started to come together in terms of, Cindy was really into post-structuralism, but also she took some courses in the English department, so brought also back some feminist analyses. And then I was increasingly interested in development issues, starting from the new international economic order to more local development issues. And having been in Mexico for a year, there was even more of a sort of an interest. And then I remember very well, it must have been in 91 or 92, I wanted to set up a discussion around gender, development, and what we then called postmodernism. And I organized a couple of panels, one panel for the ISA in Vancouver. And I tried to get people, so I started already to know some people, and I invited Jane Parpart, and that is where the book on feminism, postmodernism, development comes out of. So that's, and I had been a couple of times already to the ISA, and this was also the moment that the gender section, the feminist theory and gender section was set up. So that also helped putting that together. So that was where things started to come together. So I don't have like one incident or one conversation that really triggered it, but there was a sort of a series of conversations and events that sort of started to put things together. And in fact, at least back then in political science and in international relations, we didn't have any gender courses. So it was all, we sort of invented it in many ways. Like, okay, where can we borrow and where can we look for ideas about gender, feminism, and especially the North-South dimension.
Did you face any resistance to that? Quite, like as you say, quite masculine discipline. Really,
Yeah. No, at that time I was still tenure track, but in Vermont at Middlebury College, and I hadn't moved enough on the topic for. Can I say this for them to realize it? I was still under the radar. You can cut this out as well. And
that's the bit we'll keep.
And then I moved to the University of Amsterdam. And the University of Amsterdam at that particular time was very strong on political economy, but very strong Marxist influenced political economy. By then, I also had encountered, work by Cox and so on. So I was working within a Gramscian, Coxian framework. But I also wanted to bring in the gender dimension. So those were the debates with my colleagues in Amsterdam, because it was, class first and then maybe after a while looking at gender, And so those were the debates I had there. But at least it was accepted, and that, and also that environment in Amsterdam, it was much more, I don't want to say interdisciplinary, but there wasn't that strong of an identification with IR, right? It's like, okay, we do political economy, we do sort of different critical things, and the sort of traditional IR and the divisions with IR were not really repeated in that department. So that's why I had enough space. And then soon after the book with Jane, Ansis and Runyon came on a sabbatical, and we organized a conference on gender and global restructuring or globalization. And that's, when we really brought the IPE stuff, gender into IPE, let's put it that way.
Okay. What do you think of as your main contribution to the discipline then, or disciplines?
Yeah, okay. Oh my God. That is always because sometimes I even forget what I've written. I think for me, the first book with Jane is still, I really go back to that, and it's like, that was, I think, really, that book came out at the right moment when there were a lot of discussions within development studies, the practitioners and so on. And we really brought a lot of issues to the table that really helped to sort of, at a very critical moment. So I think that was very important. And then secondly, I wrote, before the book came out on gender and global restructuring, I wrote a piece on how to gender global restructuring and introduce the term global restructuring in that sense from a gender perspective. And I think that also was a contribution to the field.
Brilliant. There's a number of things that we wanted to pick up. So if you were giving advice to younger IPE scholars, what sort of advice would you give?
IPE scholars?
Or gender scholars, or migration scholars, or development scholars, yeah.
Advice in what sense for them to be part of the discipline?
It's a really good question, actually. I think we mean it in two ways. One, to advance, to get into the discipline, like you say, in the professional sense, but also, what are the intellectual challenges they should be thinking about?
Well, I think, and we were just talking about that yesterday at a round table, and I was sitting in the audience. And I think one of the things that is happening now to young scholars is that increasingly they're thinking in terms of their own brand. And that was something that, we didn't even think about that. But young scholars, I feel, are these days so much disciplined, literally, by the discipline, and then you have to publish in these journals that are ranked, that are in all sorts of indices. And they have to show, it's a lot of articles. I always liked edited books because you usually have, if they're done well, you have these discussions and you bring together sort of debates around certain issues. So I think I would still try to convince young scholars to find their own way and not always let themselves be disciplined. That's the resistance part in me as well. And test the boundaries and try to transgress their boundaries and try to find your own voice, because increasingly, and even they put pressure now on me, but I can say, okay, what are you going to do to me? But, as young scholars, you're really, for tenure, for promotion, for all these things, people are being literally disciplined. You have to publish in these journals. And one of the things that we also talk about is increasingly the so-called name of the game is, who are you citing and are you being cited, right? And a colleague just mentioned it to me. She said, I was in the review of an article that she wants to publish. They said, you have to cite the major debates in the U.S. on this. Why? Because again, then it reinforces the dominance and, to a certain extent, the hegemony of U.S. scholarship on this. So if the reviewers and if the editors of a journal tell you that, I think that's wrong. Why can't you cite, someone from another place that is not at the center of things? And it's still valid. It's valid scholarship, but immediately you create, a hierarchy in terms of who you're supposed to cite, what journals, and so it reinforces the mainstream. And you're constantly asked to engage with the mainstream, and that is very for critical scholarship. You're always responding. You can never say, okay, forget about that. This is what I'm doing. And I think that's where there is a problem. And just to say, I shouldn't be citing realists or liberals or whatever. I'm doing my stuff. I cite the people within my area and with whom I have a conversation. So that's what I would suggest, but it is incredibly difficult for young scholars. I understand that.
And what do you think are the big intellectual challenges facing the range of subject areas that you address?
Right now, sort of like the...
Yeah.
Well, in terms of gender issues, I would say there's a lot of backlash right now. In general, both in terms of politics, outside of academia, but even within academia. So I think there is an enormous backlash. There's, with the rise of the new populism, I think that's one of the things that we have to really worry about.
Yeah, so the Security Studies Challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there others?
And what is interesting now is I was reading a paper for the panel that you were on, or in the audience on, what we're doing with the security and the financialization. So that's interesting. So you have a securitization, and now you also have a financialization. So that's, I think, interesting, and that may also help to put the IPE back on the map in a certain way. Other challenges in terms of migration. Well, obviously the very negative views on migrants, and that is something, if you do more critical scholarship, you're always facing, because there's always the discussion about belonging, citizenship, and I think there's a lot going on these days in terms of migrations. Not all people are being trafficked. And one of the things that you see is that with the securitization and hardening of the borders, it makes it more difficult. So people need to get migrant smugglers to get across. You can't do it by yourself anymore. So that is where some of the things are going, and have been going for quite some time. Other issues in terms of migration, I think that, at least in terms of public policies and the debates, a lot of emphasis has been on the assimilation, and not enough on, if you allow a certain kind of circularity, people will come and go. And as soon as you build these walls, people can't come and go anymore, so they will be staying. And so what they will be doing is, okay, I'll just settle, because I won't be able to come back for at least a long time, until I have my papers taken care of, etc., etc. So I think it makes more sense to allow for more circular migration, because not everyone necessarily wants to stay in one place. And so this is one of the issues that have to be dealt with. And in general, migration and the new populism is obviously very closely linked, and there is a lot of xenophobic, xenophobic reactions, or there are a lot of xenophobic reactions to this. Yeah.
And do you think IPE as a discipline is well placed to deal with those kinds of challenges that you just mapped out? So the populism, the backlash, the migration, the hardening of borders, and so on.
Yeah. You have to stretch IPE, I think, because in a certain way, IPE has not been dealing directly, or not so much directly, with migration. Although they do talk about labor markets and and foreign labor or expats, etc., etc. But I don't think there is a very strong literature from IPE on migration. Yes, there are people working on it. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but it's not an area that is usually associated with IPE, which you get some of the very large ideas about the global division of labor. But for me, that is too general to really talk about what is going on. And so the migration development nexus is not really the migration development nexus is not dealt with. It's more within development studies, it's more within migration studies, not so much in the subfield of IPE.
Okay. And what's your big project now? What's going to animate you over the next few years?
Okay. I have two things. One is I am working on, I just had a project on cities with quite a lot of colleagues, and we looked at cities and the whole, the Saskia Sassen global cities kind of things. But we're looking at cities in the global south, and although Sassen is doing wonderful work, and I really like her work, the trajectories of cities in the global south is definitely not the same in terms of how to insert themselves in these global flows. So what are the ways in which they've inserted themselves in these global flows? Some people have called this the worlding of cities. And I think, and also to avoid this hierarchization of different cities, like the global cities on top, and then, you go down the hierarchy. So that is one of the things. And I'm particularly interested in making the link between migration and migrants and migratory flows and cities. And so what you get is this idea of transnational cities. So I'm right now living in Mexico, in Puebla. And so a lot of people from Puebla go to New York and New Jersey. So they've actually created a new identity. They call it Puebla York, so they show. And so how have migrants and migrations, how have they transformed cities, and how have cities become much more transnational? So you get the idea of not global cities, but transnational cities. So that is one thing that I'm working on. And the other thing is a little bit going back to the first book when we raised these issues on feminism, development, and postmodernism. I'm increasingly starting to work on the sort of debates on the one hand with post-colonialism and the other hand decolonial thought, especially because in Latin America there's a lot of stuff on decolonial thought, but it's not so accessible for English language, communities, scholarly communities. So I want to bring them into conversation with each other and see what comes out of that.
Brilliant. And are there younger scholars that you're reading now that are influencing you, or that you are excited about seeing where they go next?
Younger scholars, yes, but I'm trying to think who's, because I always find it difficult to mention one person, right?
No, sure.
Yeah. I think someone who's been doing really younger scholars, although they're now sort of almost mid-career already, is Rachel Koens. She's been working on gender and remittances and And she's been doing, she's right now working on the financialization of remittances. Marieke de Goede, who is at the University of Amsterdam, is also doing some wonderful work. Another person who is in Germany but is originally from South Africa, Rihandu Marisa. And she's been working a lot on, she published a book on Rwanda and the whole issue around that. And I think in general the topic of land grabbing and extractive industries is very important, and also from a gender perspective or feminist perspective. So I think that's where a lot of stuff is going.
And you're quite animated as you're talking. You obviously enjoy the work you do. What's the best thing about the job?
The best thing is to be with students who are really interested, so that the people who are really gung-ho about it and come up with new things. And what I really enjoy is their creativity. So I try to stimulate that. And also being here at the conference, I always, I've been coming to the ISA since the late 1980s. Okay, yes, now you know my age more or less. And for me, it's really from the beginning, it's been almost like camp, right? So you see all your friends who are in different parts of the country or the world or whatever, and you see them all here. So that for me is also, the networking, but not in a very, purposeful way, but just seeing everybody and knowing how they're doing and where they're going and what that's and the discussions we have. That is for me very important.
Just when I get to the end of an interview on any subject with participants, I nearly always say, before we came, was there a question in your mind that you thought we might ask, or that we should have asked that we haven't, and that you'd like to answer?
Let me think about that one. I think because I know that's the question you always ask, and I always ask as well. I think one of the questions I would have asked is, okay, what are your greatest deceptions, or within the field, or what are the things what are the things you would have done differently, looking back. So those are the questions.
Okay. What would you have done differently?
No answer. No.
The ethics say I shouldn't ask you about the deceptions.
Yeah. What I would have done differently, not that much actually. I may actually have thought about pushing it a little bit further. The transgressions in terms of boundaries of the discipline. And because right now I'm also teaching in a cultural studies program, and it's really interesting and wonderful and different. And so that is maybe I should have done a little bit more of that. And also I think I should have done a little bit more of sort of field work with local communities. And it's very difficult at this particular moment, Yes, I go out and I talk to people, but that sort of continuing, longer field work that anthropologists can do, we don't learn that in political science or international relations. I mean, people even like, you are going to do what? Field work, it's like almost an alien thing. And I think it would be great for political scientists and especially if you come from a critical perspective. If you talk about the everyday, live it as well. So that would be, what I would have done differently.